U.S. intelligence agencies say domestic terrorism poses an elevated threat to the country in 2021. The joint report was compiled by the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The agencies warned social and political factors such as the pandemic and the January 6th attack on the Capitol will, quote, almost certainly encourage domestic extremists to engage in further violence. President Biden requested the threat assessment shortly after taking office in the wake of the deadly Capitol attack. For more, I'm joined by CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. Hi there, Catherine. So what new information have we learned in the unclassified version of this threat assessment?
Well, Elaine, I think one of the most significant headlines is that the threat assessment talks about groups here in the United States that support white supremacy, and how they are branching out to like-minded individuals overseas. You can think of this as kind of sharing best practices. They're trying to connect with them in a virtual way, either through social media or through the internet. And then in some limited cases, what the assessment found is that individuals are traveling overseas as well, Elaine.
Well, so does law enforcement know what overseas groups these white supremacists are connecting with? And you said sort of best practices. That's essentially what they're looking to learn?
Correct. That's right. Based on my reporting here at CBS News, because I've seen other intelligence assessments that look at this issue as sort of a partnership between U.S. groups and foreign groups, and they see significant activity in Germany. And when I talk about best practices, you have to think of these groups, especially the ones that are more organized, almost like little individual businesses. They get together and they put their heads together and they say, okay, so what works for recruiting in your country, maybe it will work in my country. What kind of procedures do you use to evade law enforcement? And if you think about it in terms of sort of a military-style operation, they share what's called TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that help their operations, fundraising, recruitment, work more effectively.
Wow. Did the report, Catherine, highlight any specific groups or types of groups that officials are more concerned about?
Well, I'd say overall this is part of a broader picture, Elaine, where you see real concern not only about these, I'll call them organized militias here in the United States, but you also see evidence that law enforcement is concerned about what they call opportunists, and that was one of the leading threat vectors that came out of the Capitol riots. You had a significantly smaller group of people who are alleged to have been organized and planned some cases as early as November, but then in the moment you saw hundreds of individuals enter the Capitol seeing that opportunity present itself. So you have that bucket, and then on the other side, intelligence and law enforcement officials remain very concerned about what I would call the lone wolf or the lone actor, someone who decides to carry out an act of violence, very similar to some of our conversations about Americans who 10 or 15 years ago became radicalized by Al-Qaeda or by ISIS through the internet.
Well, Catherine, we know law enforcement was concerned about another attack on the Capitol earlier this month, and you've obtained a new intelligence assessment about the threat to Washington, D.C. What does it say about potential targets, and how significant is the threat?
Well, this is the assessment that was done by one of what they call the fusion centers in the Washington area. This is a group that gathers together what they call all-source intelligence, so that can be classified information, or it can also be what's called open-source information, so even media reports, and they try and bundle that together and use that to make recommendations for decision makers. The element that they found most concerning is that the threat remains high targeting Washington, D.C., but specifically institutions, so reading in between the lines, places like the Capitol, and then as well as individuals. And that they also saw evidence that despite the fact that there is certainly increased surveillance of these groups after January 6th, there hasn't been a tamping down of the radicalization process. And also what they see is a new interest by these groups to kind of hit back, if you will, at big tech, who they believe are sharing their information with federal investigators.
Finally, Catherine, where does the investigation into the January 6th attack on the Capitol stand now?
I was just looking down because I got some new numbers for you before I sat down at the desk. And right now, in terms of federal and I'll say local prosecutions here in Washington, it's 312 individuals. But significantly, what prosecutors are saying is that they expect another 100 individuals will be charged in the coming weeks. I want you to just think about that. Over 400 people. That's about half the number that went into the Capitol itself. And when you look at the type of evidence that they're collecting to make these cases, the FBI director recently said that they have 270,000 digital tips. So what does that mean? We're not only talking about video from social media, but we're also talking about thousands of hours of body cam video from Capitol Police and D.C. Metro Police here in Washington, D.C., but then also that network of surveillance cameras around the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, the Dirksen Building, the Russell Building, the Longworth Building. All of that video is being crunched by investigators in order to identify suspects and then build cases against them. But as you know, even 10 weeks into this investigation, some of the most violent suspects, especially when it came to the assault on federal officers, they've been able to identify who they are in the video, but they still, despite these awesome capabilities to identify American citizens at their disposal, they still have drawn a blank, and now they are asking or renewing their ask to the public to help them identify and track down these individuals.
All right, Catherine Herridge with the latest for us in Washington. Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.